Look, I need to share something that's been weighing on me after years of studying Jung's work. What happens when someone who's done the hardest psychological work imaginable, facing their own darkness, encounters someone who's built their entire identity on avoiding theirs? This isn't just theory. This is about a collision of psychological realities that Jung observed throughout his career, and it's one of the most fascinating dynamics in human behavior. Jung spent decades working with patients who struggled with what he called the shadow, that part of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or hidden away, because it doesn't fit the image we want to project. Most people spend their entire lives running from this darkness. They build elaborate defenses, create false personas, and construct entire identities designed to keep them from ever having to look at the parts of themselves they find unacceptable. But there are people who do the opposite. Empaths who've done something extraordinary. They've turned around and faced that darkness directly. They've integrated their shadow. And when these integrated individuals encounter narcissistic personalities, something profound happens. The narcissist doesn't just dislike them, they fear them deeply. Jung worked with patients across the spectrum of human psychology, and he noticed something consistent in those who exhibited what we'd now recognize as narcissistic patterns. These individuals had constructed what he called an inflated ego, a grandiose self-image that required constant validation and protection. But underneath that inflation, a shadow so dense, so packed with rejected material, that their entire psychological structure depended on never acknowledging it. One patient Jung described had built an impressive career, commanded respect in social circles, and presented an image of absolute confidence. Yet in therapeutic work, Jung observed something striking. Any attempt to explore deeper emotional territory, any suggestion that perhaps this carefully constructed image wasn't the whole story, was met with intense resistance. Not just disagreement, fear. The kind of fear that manifests as rage, deflection, or complete withdrawal. What Jung understood is that this wasn't about ego protection in the simple sense. This was about psychological survival. For someone who's built their entire identity on an inflated self-image, the shadow isn't just uncomfortable, it's existential threat. Every denied impulse, every rejected vulnerability, every moment of genuine weakness they've ever experienced gets stuffed into that shadow. And the bigger it grows, the more terrifying it becomes. Now, contrast that with someone who's done shadow work. An empath who's sat with their own darkness, who's acknowledged their capacity for anger, for selfishness, for cruelty, who's looked at the parts of themselves they're not proud of and said, yes, this is also me. This person has integrated what Jung called the totality of the psyche. They're not pretending to be all light. They've just done the work of becoming whole. When these two types of people interact, the narcissistic individual experiences something they can't articulate, but can definitely feel. The integrated empath isn't playing the games that usually work. They're not competing for status. They're not seeking validation. They're not mirroring the grandiose self-image back. Instead, they're just present, authentic, operating from a place of genuine integration. Jung observed this dynamic repeatedly. When someone with an inflated ego encounters someone who's integrated their shadow, they experience what he called constellation of the unconscious. The very presence of integrated wholeness activates everything they've been running from. It's like holding up a mirror that doesn't reflect the carefully constructed image. It reflects the totality, including everything they've denied. The integrated empath isn't doing anything aggressive. They're not attacking or judging, but their mere existence, their way of being in the world, their comfort with complexity and contradiction, their ability to acknowledge both light and dark, all of this triggers a profound psychological response in the narcissistic individual. Because somewhere deep in their unconscious, they recognize what integration looks like, and they know, at some level, they can't admit that they don't have it. This is what separates surface-level psychology from Jung's deeper insights. Most people think narcissists fear empaths because empaths see through their facade. That's partially true, but it's not the whole story. The real terror comes from something more fundamental. The integrated empath represents everything the narcissistic individual has structured their entire life to avoid becoming. Think about it. If you've spent decades building walls against your own shadow, if you've invested enormous psychological energy into maintaining an inflated self-image, if your entire sense of identity depends on never acknowledging your darkness, then what happens when you encounter someone who's done the exact opposite? Someone who's dismantled those walls, who's faced that darkness, who's emerged not diminished, but integrated. It's not just threatening, it's destabilizing. Jung wrote about how the unconscious communicates through what he called archetypal images and energies. When a narcissistic individual encounters an integrated empath, their unconscious recognizes an archetypal pattern, the pattern of wholeness, of individuation completed, and that recognition creates cognitive dissonance so severe it manifests as fear, often disguised as contempt, dismissal, or rage. Here's what I've noticed after studying countless cases. The integrated empath doesn't have to say anything about the darkness to trigger this response. They don't have to point out contradictions or call out behavior. Their energy alone, that sense of psychological integration, that comfort with paradox, that absence of splitting the world into all good or all bad, creates an unbearable tension for someone whose entire psychological structure depends on maintaining rigid defenses against their own complexity. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when taken to an extreme. The narcissistic individual, in their extreme flight from darkness, becomes dominated by it. Meanwhile, the empath who's faced their darkness discovers something unexpected: light. Not the false light of denied shadow, but genuine light that comes from integration. And that genuine light is what the narcissistic personality finds most unbearable, because it can't be faked, can't be performed, can't be mimicked through inflation. This dynamic plays out in ways that are both subtle and profound. The narcissistic individual might feel compelled to diminish the integrated empath, to find flaws, to create drama. Not because the empath has done anything wrong, but because their wholeness is a constant reminder of the fragmentation the narcissistic individual refuses to acknowledge. Every interaction becomes a psychological battlefield, where the narcissist is fighting not against the empath, but against the terror of their own unintegrated shadow. And here's the tragedy. This fear is precisely what keeps the narcissistic individual trapped. The very thing they need most, integration of the shadow, is the thing they're most terrified to pursue. And the people who could model that integration, who could show that it's possible to face darkness and emerge whole, are the people they must destroy, diminish, or distance themselves from. Because if they acknowledge the value of what those integrated empaths have achieved, they'd have to acknowledge what they themselves are missing. What Jung discovered through decades of clinical work was that this fear response isn't random. It's rooted in the fundamental architecture of how we construct identity. When someone builds their sense of self on what he called identification with the persona, they're essentially creating a character to play in life's drama, rather than becoming an authentic individual. The narcissistic personality takes this to an extreme, constructing what Jung termed a mana personality, an inflated identification with archetypal power. When I first understood this distinction, it changed how I viewed these dynamics entirely. The narcissistic individual isn't just pretending to be more than they are. They've actually convinced themselves at a deep psychological level that they are the inflated image. Their ego has fused with an archetypal energy, the hero, the king, the genius, the savior. And this fusion creates a psychological structure that's both powerful and incredibly fragile. Jung worked with patients who exhibited this pattern, and he noted something crucial. The more inflated the identification, the more violent the defense when that inflation is threatened. Why? Because deflation doesn't just mean embarrassment or loss of status. It means psychological annihilation. If I am the genius, the special one, the superior being, then any evidence to the contrary doesn't just challenge my self-esteem, it threatens my entire existence. Enter the integrated empath, someone who's done what Jung called individuation work, the process of becoming a whole, unique individual rather than a collection of inflated identifications or unconscious patterns. This person has met their shadow, recognized it, and integrated it. They've dismantled grandiose identifications, not because they're humble in a false way, but because they've discovered something more valuable: authentic selfhood. The integrated empath operates from what Jung called the self, with a capital S. Not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of conscious and unconscious working together. They've achieved what the narcissistic individual claims to have, but actually fears: genuine wholeness. And you can't fake this. You can't perform it. It has a quality that Jung described as numinous. It carries psychological weight that others feel unconsciously. When these two energies meet, something happens at the unconscious level that the narcissistic individual experiences as threat. The integrated empath isn't playing by the rules of ego inflation. They're not competing for the title of most special. They're not seeking to prove superiority. They're simply being, authentically, complexly, paradoxically. And this authentic being, this comfort with human limitation alongside genuine strength, this integration of light and shadow registers in the narcissist's unconscious as deeply threatening. Jung observed that patients with narcissistic patterns would often become hostile toward therapy itself when the work began pointing toward shadow integration. One patient became enraged when Jung suggested that perhaps their public successes were compensating for private insecurities, not because the observation was cruel, but because it threatened the entire psychological structure they'd built. That question, what lies beneath, is precisely what the narcissistic individual cannot allow themselves to explore. Their shadow has become what Jung called demonic through neglect and denial. All the vulnerability, all the shame, all the inadequacy, all the very human weakness they've ever felt gets compressed into this denied psychological space, and the longer it's denied, the more monstrous it seems. The integrated empath, having faced their own monstrous shadow and discovered it was ultimately human, no longer radiates the fear-based energy that the narcissistic individual expects. There's no desperation to prove worth, no frantic efforts to maintain an image, no splitting the world into all good and all bad. Instead, there's something Jung called paradox holding, the ability to contain contradiction without collapsing into simplistic either-or thinking. This paradox holding is what the narcissistic personality finds most destabilizing. Integrated empaths can acknowledge their own capacity for darkness without being consumed by shame. They can recognize their genuine strengths without inflating into grandiosity. They can see the narcissist's humanity, even while setting boundaries against their behavior. This complexity, this psychological sophistication, this comfort with the ambiguity of being human, it's incomprehensible to someone whose entire structure depends on maintaining rigid categories of superior and inferior. Jung wrote about how the unconscious seeks completion. It pushes us toward whatever we've left undeveloped. When a narcissistic individual encounters an integrated empath, their unconscious recognizes the completion they lack. But instead of this recognition leading to growth, it triggers defense. The ego, identified with inflation, interprets the unconscious push toward integration as an attack, so it counterattacks, through devaluation, through rage, through attempts to destroy the very thing that could help them become whole. This is the profound irony Jung saw repeatedly. The narcissistic individual needs exactly what they fear most. They need to integrate the shadow, to deflate the grandiose identification, to become human rather than remaining inflated. The integrated empath represents proof that this transformation is possible, that you can face the darkness and survive, that wholeness is achievable. But that proof is unbearable because accepting it would require genuine self-examination. What I've learned from diving deep into Jung's clinical observations is that this dynamic isn't about good people versus bad people. It's about different relationships with the unconscious. The integrated empath has developed what Jung called ego-self axis, a connection between conscious awareness and the deeper self that includes the shadow. The narcissistic individual has severed that axis, inflating the ego at the expense of genuine relationship with the totality of the psyche. When these two meet, it's not just a personality clash. It's a collision of different psychological realities. The integrated person is operating from wholeness, which includes acknowledged limitation. The narcissistic person is operating from inflation, which denies limitation entirely. The integrated person's comfort with human weakness directly challenges the narcissistic person's defense against that very weakness. Jung noted that patients with inflated ego structures would often experience integrated individuals as too intense or too much, or even dangerous. They'd create elaborate narratives about why the integrated person was actually flawed, secretly weak, or covertly inferior. These narratives served a psychological function. If the integrated person could be diminished, then their threatening wholeness could be dismissed. Here's where it gets personal for many people. If you're an empath who's done shadow work, you've probably experienced this dynamic without understanding it. You've probably encountered narcissistic individuals who seemed threatened by your mere existence, who attacked your character, questioned your motives, or tried to destabilize your sense of reality. And you probably wondered what you did wrong. But here's what Jung would tell you. You didn't do anything wrong. Your wholeness, your integration, your comfort with complexity, these aren't flaws. They're psychological achievements. The narcissistic individual's fear response isn't about you. It's about them confronting through your presence everything they've built their life to avoid. What happens in shadow work, what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, is essentially a death and rebirth process. The ego that we've constructed, the image we've built, the way we've learned to protect ourselves, all of it has to be examined and, in many cases, dismantled. The empath who's done this work has experienced psychological death. They've felt their carefully constructed identity crack open. They've sat with the terror of not knowing who they are when all the defenses fall away. And they've survived it. That survival isn't just intellectual. It's encoded in their nervous system, in their presence, in how they move through the world. Jung observed that patients who'd completed significant individuation work carried themselves differently. Not with the puffed-up confidence of ego inflation, but with what he called quiet authority, a grounded presence that comes from having faced the abyss and returned. The narcissistic individual hasn't faced the abyss. They've built elaborate structures to ensure they never have to. Every defense mechanism, every manipulation, every grandiose claim serves one purpose: keeping the shadow at bay. Their entire life becomes organized around avoiding the very confrontation that the integrated empath has already endured and survived. When these two people interact, something profound happens at the unconscious level. The integrated empath's energy, that quiet authority, that comfort with darkness, that absence of desperate defense, triggers recognition in the narcissistic individual's unconscious. At some level they can't articulate. They sense that this person has done something they're terrified to do. This person has faced the monster and lived. This person has died and been reborn. This person has achieved psychological wholeness, and that recognition is unbearable. Jung worked with patients who would describe feeling exposed or seen through by certain individuals, even when those individuals hadn't said or done anything overtly challenging. What was happening? The patient's unconscious was recognizing in the other person a quality of integration they themselves lacked. The shadow, denied and repressed, was constellating, becoming activated in response to the other person's wholeness. I've studied this pattern across countless therapeutic scenarios Jung documented, and here's what consistently emerges. The narcissistic individual experiences the integrated empath's presence as a kind of psychological X-ray. Not because the empath is trying to see through them, but because integrated wholeness naturally perceives complexity. The empath who's faced their own shadow doesn't need to split people into all good or all bad. They can hold paradox. They can see the narcissist's humanity alongside their destructive behavior. And this perception, this ability to see the totality rather than just the performed persona, is what the narcissistic individual finds most threatening. Because if someone can see through the grandiose image to the frightened ego beneath, then the whole defensive structure fails. If the performance isn't convincing, if the inflation isn't working, then what's the point? Jung called this experience soul loss. The narcissistic individual, in inflating the ego, has actually lost connection with the deeper self. They've traded authenticity for inflation, genuine strength for performed superiority, real relationship for admiration extraction. And they can't admit this loss because admitting it would mean confronting everything they've structured their life to avoid. The integrated empath, having reclaimed their own soul through shadow work, operates from a place of psychological fullness that the narcissistic individual no longer has access to. This fullness isn't about being perfect or healed of all wounds. It's about being whole, integrated, complex, human. And wholeness, Jung discovered, carries a quality that inflation can never replicate: authenticity. Here's what makes this dynamic so psychologically sophisticated. The narcissistic individual often can't articulate why they feel so threatened. They might say the empath is too sensitive or too intense or thinks they're special. They might claim the empath is actually the narcissist, projecting their own patterns. These accusations serve a psychological function. They attempt to destabilize the empath's integration and avoid the uncomfortable truth that genuine wholeness exists and they don't have it. Jung observed patients engaging in what he called psychological murder, attempts to destroy another person's sense of psychological reality. When a narcissistic individual encounters an integrated empath, they often unconsciously attempt this destruction. Not through physical violence, but through gaslighting, through reality distortion, through systematic attacks on the empath's perception, character, and sanity. Why? Because if they can make the empath doubt their own integration, then integration itself becomes questionable. But here's what Jung understood. Integrated wholeness can't be destroyed by external attack. Once you've faced your shadow, once you've integrated the denied aspects of self, once you've achieved a degree of individuation, that can't be taken away. It can be challenged, tested, pressed against, but it can't be undone. The narcissistic individual's attacks are ultimately futile because they're trying to destroy something that's been forged in the fire of genuine psychological work. The empath who's done shadow work has already faced their worst fears about themselves. They've already sat with their capacity for darkness. They've already endured the collapse of their defended ego. What's a narcissist's accusation compared to that? What's external invalidation compared to having already invalidated yourself and survived it? What's someone else's rage compared to having integrated your own? This is the true source of the narcissistic individual's fear. Not just that the integrated empath sees through them, but that the integrated empath can't be destroyed by the usual tactics. The psychological weapons that work on others, shame, doubt, reality distortion, don't penetrate someone who's already faced their own internal monsters. The integrated person has developed what Jung called psychological immunity, not invulnerability, but resilience rooted in having already survived the worst the unconscious can throw at you. Now I need to give you something practical. If you're an integrated empath who's encountered narcissistic fear responses, you need a framework for navigating these situations without sacrificing your wholeness. Jung developed what he called the 4 stages of dealing with unconscious projection. First stage, recognition. You must recognize that the narcissistic individual's fear response isn't about you. It's about what you represent to their unconscious. Their attacks, their projections, their attempts to destabilize you, none of it is actually aimed at who you are. It's aimed at the threat you pose to their defensive structure. This recognition provides psychological clarity about what's happening. Second stage, differentiation. You must differentiate your reality from their projection. This means maintaining clear boundaries between what you know to be true about yourself and what they're claiming about you. This isn't about defending or explaining. It's about internal clarity. You've done shadow work. You know your darkness. You know your light. Their projections can't change your actual reality. Third stage, boundary setting. You must set and maintain clear boundaries about what you will and won't engage with. This means being clear about where your psychological sovereignty begins and ends. You don't need to accept their version of reality. You don't need to participate in their inflation games. You don't need to absorb their projected shadow material. You can say no to the entire dynamic. Fourth stage, acceptance. You must accept that you cannot heal their fear through your presence, your patience, or your understanding. No matter how much you demonstrate that integration is possible, no matter how much you model wholeness, you cannot do their shadow work for them. Their fear of integration is their own to face or avoid. Your responsibility is to maintain your own integration, not to prove its value to someone who's structured their entire identity around denying it. Jung emphasized that this framework isn't about becoming cold or withdrawing compassion. It's about recognizing the limits of what you can do for someone who's trapped in narcissistic defense. You can have empathy for their fear while refusing to sacrifice your wholeness to accommodate it. You can understand their psychological structure while declining to participate in their projection systems. You can see their humanity while maintaining boundaries against their behavior. This balance, compassion with boundaries, understanding with self-protection, seeing their pain while refusing to absorb it, is what Jung called conscious suffering. You're not avoiding the difficulty of the situation, you're fully present to it. But you're present from a place of integration rather than from enmeshment or defense. You can witness their struggle without making it your own. Your work now is to honor the integration you've achieved while maintaining clear boundaries with those who fear it. To remain grounded in your reality while others project their shadow onto you. To continue operating from wholeness while navigating dynamics designed to destabilize it. This isn't easy work, but it's the natural extension of the shadow work you've already done. You've done something extraordinary by integrating your shadow. You've achieved something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And if that achievement triggers fear in others, remember, their fear isn't evidence of your flaw, it's evidence of your wholeness. Keep honoring that wholeness. Keep maintaining that integration. Keep operating from the authentic self you've worked so hard to reclaim.